But have you listened to any of the previous recordings that we've done?
I don't think I have. No.
No, well, the Our Lives in Horror project, it span out of Kit Power's original My Life in Horror project, which he has now finished, obviously, and handed on to me. And the whole premise of it was to sort of create an archive of horror creators' experience and influence, if you like. It's very the format is very casual. We don't really necessarily do formal introductions or anything like that. It's just a chat about where does it come from. You know, what is it that influenced and inspired you as a horror writer, as a horror creator? Are there things, for example, in your childhood, some key piece of media or image that really sparked that fascination?
Okay. I mean, I've been a horror fan since I was like very, very young.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my earliest memories is of my family sitting down to watch the Salem's Lot miniseries when it originally. So, that was 1979, so I would have been 5.
Oh, wow. And that was a piece of family viewing, right?
Yeah, I grew up in a very permissive household when it came to what I watched and read. So, but yeah, I have a vivid memory. I don't remember the whole thing, but I have a vivid memory of us sitting there in certain key scenes.
Uh-huh.
Of course, the scratching at the window scene.
Obviously, the big one, the one that comes up in almost every top 10 scary moments list, yeah?
I can remember scenes like, when he was at the morgue and the sun down and he was desperately trying to make the cross from the tongue depressors.
Oh, yes, yes.
I can remember that. And then when I was about 10, I remember they aired The Exorcist on TV and my mother was watching it and I begged her to let me watch it with her. And I only made about halfway through and then I ended up hiding behind the sofa and she sent me to bed.
That's actually amazing. Certainly to a British person, because it was banned here for the longest time. There was no television broadcast of it. There was no physical media of it until the late 90s, I don't think.
Okay. And and it was for TV, so there was a lot of stuff cut out, but it was still, like I said, that it sent me behind the sofa. And I think what affected me with those two things is that as a kid, I watched a lot of things. I watched a lot of different genre of things, but horror was the only one that really got that much of a reaction from me.
Yeah.
And because I can still remember those things, and I don't remember much else I was watching around that time.
Right, so it's formative, yeah?
Yeah. So I got this impression that horror is the genre that really grabs you and stays with you. And so, from then on, it's almost like I didn't have a choice. Horror was that was just it for me. So
it was indelible, right? It imprinted upon you at one of your most formative moments and impressionable moments.
It did. And then I remember we were a little late in the VCR revolution, but when we did get a VCR, it was just going to the local mom and pop video store and cleaning out the horror section.
Yeah.
And then when I really got into reading, that was the genre I gravitated toward. And I still love other genres. But horror, like I said, it's just, it feels like it's a part of my personality in a way that other things do not.
It's really fascinating because this is something that has come up again and again and again in all of these conversations. There seems to be a moment where an experience is had, where there is something on the television or there is a video that's rented or something that's overseen by accident that impresses upon people, and it's often when they're quite young. And it informs the shape of their imagination. It changes the topography of their mind somehow. And again, this thing with media becoming so much more available, during our childhoods, so we were able to go to the video rental store, and of course horror had its heyday on video at that point. Throughout the 1980s, it was one of the horror was just pervasive, right?
Yeah, and and I grew up in the 80s, which you said was the sort of like golden era of horror films in a way.
Yeah, very much
And even
so.
if we had a VCR, the 80s were a different time.
Yeah.
Technically, at 12 years old, I wasn't supposed to be able to go see a rated R movie by myself, but they let me. So I would would walk down to the local theater, the Capri, and I would see all the new Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street and Halloween and Child's Play and just all of that. And it was just, I would get so excited. And because before the internet age, I wouldn't know when the new installment of a franchise I loved was coming out till I saw that first ad on TV.
Of course. So it had a different patina back then.
Yeah. And so I would get so excited and start planning, I have to go see it. And it was just, and like I said, I can remember one of my older sisters had a sleepover and they all were watching Friday the 13th Part 2. Like linked back of the room, and I can remember the final big jump scare and all the girls in the room screaming and sort of leaning. And I couldn't sleep that night. Right. And it almost seems weird to other people that you couldn't sleep that night, so you think that's enjoyable, but no other storytelling I was experiencing kept me up at night. And there was power in that,
So there's power in it, It aroused you in a very particular way that probably nothing else had up to that point.
And like I said, when I got into reading, that I found the same thing in the books by Stephen King and Dean Koontz and Clive Barker. When I discovered,
of course, God Almighty, Barker's been a big one on this show. A lot of the people, a lot of the writers I've spoken to, King and Barker are right up there, definitely.
Yeah, so that just, and when I got into reading those people, it was just like nonstop. I was just reading book after, and I can remember sitting in my room as a teenager. I would stay up late at night, just reading with Coke or coffee or something to keep me awake.
It's amazing, isn't it? I find it fascinating when you have to, and many of our audience will actually be people who were not even born in the 1980s, right? So explaining these particular experiences to them, where they perhaps grew up with the ready availability of VHS and DVDs and even the internet, the rarity of the experience. Like if the horror film was on the television, it was on the television and that was it. You lost it after that, apart from the impression that it made in your mind for a little while, at least it was gone. The experience of that is very particular to that time.
It is true, because before we had a VCR, I would just have to hope. If I wasn't able to go see it in the theater, I would have to hope they did a TV showing. Yeah. And then, because I had this weird gap. Like I had seen Halloween 2 a gazillion times, because for some reason it was that one they showed on our local TV stations at Halloween. So it wasn't until we got a VCR when I was a teenager that I ever got to see the first Halloween that I had seen.
Right. So that's very unusual, isn't it? So you had the sort of the second half of that particular story first.
And it was the same with Friday the 13th. I had seen Part 2. Now, Part 2 has such a long recap. I watched the first Friday the 13th. I felt like I had already watched it.
Right.
Yeah, and so I would have all these gaps so that when we did get a VCR, I was finally able to fill in all those gaps, and it was very exciting. And I do love the streaming age where almost everything is available.
Yeah, likewise.
At a drop of a hat, suddenly have a hankering for a certain movie, and I know I'm going to be able to find it.
Yeah.
But there was also something kind of special about that search through the video store, looking at the covers, to see what caught your eye. Like, I can remember watching Sleepaway Camp 2 just because it had a cover that caught my attention.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I mean, I was born in 1984, so VHS and VCRs were just readily available at that point, and the small video stores, the video rental stores, were in their ascendance. They were everywhere, and the experience of and again, like you, I kind of grew up in a fairly permissive household. My mum's a huge horror fan, and she had all of Stephen King's milieu on her bookshelf. She had all of Dean Koontz, she had James Patterson, she had a few Clive Barkers, and her VHS library was primarily horror. It was absolutely enormous. But going down to the local VHS store and this sort of Aladdin's cave. I even remember like the actual physical store itself was this wonderful sort of darkly lit, like almost slightly neon, strange place where all of those wonderful horror VHSs were laid out, and you could the wonderful covers, the cover artwork that was so enticing, and often it promised a lot more than the films actually delivered. But there's something to be said about the experience of that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it was like when we first got it, it was, every Friday we would go to the video, and I looked forward to it so much. And then as I got older and I would go to the video store myself, like it was like almost like a treasure hunt.
Yeah, and absolutely.
I would use it I can remember as a teenager, I decided I was going to write a vampire novel. Mm-hmm. So me and my best friend at the time went to the video store and just rented a ton of vampire movies and had sort of a vampire movie marathon just to get me, pumped up the mood for doing my own vampire thing. And I don't know. And I've never lost that love of the genre. I mean, it's gone through its ups and downs, and sometimes people really put it down, but I'm like, even the 80s, because they talk about, during that horror boom with horror novels, there was a lot of what some people call trash, and I'm like, well, there was a lot of good stuff, but I loved even being able to go into the local drugstore and know there were going to be horror novels on their paperback rack.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something Kit and I talk about a lot. There's that weird distinction which exists right now, actually, between sort of like pulp horror and literary horror, which is not something I really understand myself. The distinction doesn't really mean a great deal to me. The ability, as it was in the 80s, you could literally go into shops that were not even related to media or literature, and you would find this array of horror paperbacks, right, that have been mass printed by loads of different writers, some of whom only existed in that particular swell. They've never done anything since, and the ability to do that was just the most wonderful thing.
Yeah, and it's exactly like you said. Like it was just everywhere. It was pervasive, and for someone who loved horror, that was wonderful. And I do look back fondly at some of those paperbacks I would buy at the drugstore, and because I'm weird like that, I do wonder like what happened to those writers, because like you said, it's like they were never heard from again. But I'm like, because as an aspiring writer, I would, I didn't make a distinction between, fancy hardcover from one of the main New York publishers and the vampire paperback I just picked up at the drugstore. I'm just like, this person got a book published.
Yeah, right. There's something wonderfully consumptive about it, isn't there? You especially when you're at that age, when you just want everything, when you find what your enthusiasms are, and you just want you want to immerse yourself in it completely. There's nothing else in your life, right? You don't make that distinction, do you? You just want it all. It doesn't matter if it's kind of trashy or if it's considered to be the higher end of the spectrum. It's all welcome. it's all welcome. And I'll be honest, to a certain degree, it really still is for me. I mean, I will happily devour, like, what's considered sort of like I hate the term, but sort of like a lower rent horror book or whatever, something that's a bit more pulpy and fun. Happily. Absolutely.
I agree. I think there's room for everything.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't need to be tribal. It doesn't need to be, it doesn't need to be exclusive.
Because I feel like sometimes people get into that mindset that this is what I like, therefore it's really all there should be.
Yes, it's a bizarre one, isn't it? It's a bizarre one. And don't get me wrong. I mean, there are obviously creators, as there are in any genre or medium, whose technical ability is unbelievable. I mean, you mentioned Barker. Barker is like, Barker is the reason I write, full stop. I mean, his stuff just, it still consumes my life to this day. And every time, even though I'm very familiar with practically everything he's ever written at this point, every time I go back to it, it knocks me on my ass. I just can't believe it. I can't believe this guy exists. I can't believe that this imagination and this technical capacity with language exists,
I could go on about Clive Barker forever, but that you kind of nail on the head. Like what gets me about him is his imagination is it's almost unfathomable. I'm like, I think I have a developed imagination, but I mean, he's coming up with stuff that I'm like, I don't even know how the mind conjures that. But once I discovered him and his bold and just out there ideas that he makes you believe in when you're in the story, I'm like, get enough. And then I find him fascinating as a person.
Yeah, me too.
So, and he has such passion for it, and he's such an unapologetic, this is what I do.
Yep.
Love, hate it. It's what he loves, and that's all that matters.
And that's what matters, right? And that gives it such incredible power. I mean, like, looking back at him contextually as well, when you look at the milieu of 1980s horror writers, no one was doing what he was doing at that time. Just no one. It's in a bracket of its own. It's so deviant. It's so transgressive. Obviously, a lot of that does derive from his social class as a working class guy. As an underclass guy for the longest time. I mean, when he made Hellraiser, he was pretty down and out. And as a queer man, right, as a gay man.
That, and definitely as a gay man myself, when he publicly came out, and I still remember, was in an Advocate magazine article. It was kind of world-changing to me because I wanted to be a horror writer. I was writing all the time, but I did have trouble conceiving because I never saw queer representation in our genre.
Absolutely. This is exactly it. I've had this conversation so many times. I was 11 when I discovered Clive Barker, so even I didn't really have the language to describe that I was a gay man at that point. I didn't have the language, but I understood on a visceral level at that point, or even like a putative level, that that's what I was. And it didn't occur to me because we are so glutted with straight white guys, right? That is what predominates the genre at that time. Sort of like, the late 1980s coming into the 1990s. It didn't occur to me that you could be a queer writer, that you could be a gay man who writes about being gay, the experience of that. It just didn't occur to me until I discovered Clive Barker.
That's exactly it. I didn't feel like you could do it. I mean,
that's it. It's so weird, isn't it?
Even the stuff I was writing back then, I was writing straight characters because everything I saw said, this is how you have to do it.
Right. This is how it's done, right? It's like fantasy, for example. And fantasy, I would argue, has been slower in this regard because of the predominance of people like Tolkien and whatnot and C.S. Lewis. was the longest time before you saw even the suggestion of queer characters in a fantasy setting.
And when he came out in that Advocate article, I want to say it was a year or so later, he released the book Sacrament.
Oh my God, yeah.
It had a gay main character.
Gay main character, and it's about the experience of being a gay man, right? It's like down to the bone, down to the soul.
Because I mean, it was using this whole metaphor of like animals that were in danger of extinction, and you know, to talk about gay men in the time of AIDS, and I'm like, like from a major publisher, a major horror title by a well-known, and that's when I realized like there is a place for us.
Yep.
And I can write horror fiction and inject it with my own queer sensibility and experience. Yep. And he made that all seem possible.
Yeah, and the fact that I mean, again, it's the fact that he demonstrates, certainly in Sacrament, because he goes out of his way to do it, to demonstrate that there are exclusively queer concerns that can be explored in this material. You can express concerns that do not actually exist in more traditional straight written horror. And the metaphysics that he creates in that book of being a gay man in that era, where he talks about as being like little evolutionary dead ends to which the narratives that apply to our straight siblings do not apply, or at least traditionally do not apply. And therefore we have to create our own. We have to write our own sense of self, our own identity. I remember reading that, and it like just rewriting the topography of my mind. Yeah. You know, changing everything, because it never occurred to me before that you could talk about our experience and what we are and how we feel and what we do in metaphysical terms.
And what's also so great about that is it showed me that injecting marginalized creators into the horror genre is going to be what keeps it alive and fresh. Because there's some people who, if they experience horror from a queer person or even a person of color, they'll say, well, this is too political or too preachy. Right. And I'm like, I think what you're seeing is we have life experiences that you don't have.
Exactly that.
We put that in there. Like, it's almost like what some people want when they talk about diversity in horror is they want the same old story, but you say that character is gay.
Yes, that's an issue, isn't it? That is really an issue. And that can even derive from people who consider themselves ostensibly as allies, right?
And so I'm like, you know, that's great. But when you have queer creators, we're going to bring our own life experience and perspective into it, not because we want to necessarily teach a lesson, but because that's our lives. Like, that's just what we encounter every day.
That's what we do. That's what we are. It's what we think. It's what we imagine, right? That's our experience of reality. And to not do that, to sort of err on the side of tradition or of like the prescriptions of the genre as it has always been, there's a certain insincerity in that.
Yeah. So, you know, I don't know, I went on sort of a couple of years ago, I just decided, just because I wanted to enrich my own reading, I was going to spend the entire year only reading women, people of color, and queer authors.
Yeah.
That's because that, straight white men write a lot of quality fiction.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is not, I mean, that's another thing as well. This is not exclusivist, you know. The raw fact of the matter is that, you know, straight white men have had the predominance over the genre for the longest time. You know, it's not that difficult for them, really.
And, what got me to thinking I wanted to do that was because I realized as a queer person, I still didn't read that many queer authors just because I grew up in a time where I wasn't exposed to a lot of queer authors. Therefore,
course.
I had already kind of found my favorites among the straight white male writers that were writing, who I still love. And I'm like, much more out there. I want to take some time to explore it and find other authors. And I really feel, in the small press at least, queer horror authors are finally starting to come into their own.
Oh yeah, it's all happening, isn't it? I mean, it's amazing to see. It's absolutely amazing to see, like, coming in from sort of like the 1980s and 1990s, seeing it effloresce, and now it's booming. It's absolutely booming. There are so many of us out there, so many voices.
And I'm hopeful this will eventually work its way up to, like, mainstream or
Yeah.
But in the small press horror, I'm just loving all these diverse voices that are coming out, and it's exciting because when I was a teenager, I had a hunger to see myself reflect the genre I loved, and I would try to find stuff. I can remember ordering on this. I mean, this is going to make me sound so ancient, but because this was before the internet age. In the back of New York Times book review, which I used to go to the library and read, I found an advertisement for this service where you would call a 1-800 number, put books in their warehouse, you would mail them a check, and would mail you the books.
Wow,
So,
imagine that, guys. You physically had to send, like, your check in an envelope, and you would get your book eventually in the mail.
I grew up in a small southern town. I didn't have access to a large array of books. Even our public library was, limited. So I can remember I ordered a book that I had heard about somewhere called Vampires Anonymous.
Okay.
And it was a gay vampire. I mean, and I remember it was really more kind of an erotic romance, but with vampires.
As they tended to be from that era.
But, it was the closest thing I could find to, like, a queer horror novel at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, because of course, I mean, like, up until that point, really, if there were queer characters in horror novels, they tended to be written by straight writers. And there was a tendency for them to be either monsters or victims, right?
Yep. I mean, that was really all we had to go on.
Yeah.
And that's,
excuse me,
I could find. And so now I just love that, there are all these options for young readers today.
Yeah.
Who want themselves reflected. And
it's amazing to think, isn't it? It's rather difficult to explain to people who were not alive at the time that this just didn't exist. It didn't exist in media in general, really. And certainly in the UK, you started to see a difference towards the late 1990s and early 2000s. There were certain landmark moments in, for example, like popular broadcast television, where you had the first sort of, like, openly gay characters, or even, like, openly gay dramas like Queer as Folk, for example. That was a huge thing in the UK. That was enormous, Queer as Folk, because it was one of the first mainstream TV dramas that not only featured almost exclusively gay characters, it was deliberately written to explore the sincere experience of being a gay man of the era. So it pulled absolutely no punches. Absolutely no punches. It's the warts and all telling, and it was really significant. It was really significant. After that, it's a horrible term to use, but it normalized us to such a degree that it changed the culture. It changed cultural preconception.
That's interesting because in the States, I feel like what happened was first you had Ellen, who came out she came out and then her sitcom character came out.
Right.
I remember I was in college when that happened, and I couldn't believe that every week there was a gay character on TV talking about it.
Yeah, right?
I mean, there was huge pushback to that. I can remember,
Right.
I mean, it was an innocuous sitcom, but it started having parental advisory warnings at the beginning.
Yeah.
And, you know, for a while there, it kind of ended her career for several. But then, right after that, we got Will and Grace.
Of course.
Which is a very benign show. But what it did when it became a hit was every single week there were gay people in millions of people's homes.
Yep.
Which had never happened before. And I really do think, I look back and I can see how that helped people in the States start to, like you said, it sort of normalized it. They enjoy tuning in and laughing with those characters. And then I actually think it started to shift some opinion in the public.
Yeah, it's an incredible thing, right? It's an amazing thing to think now, but it was these things were so significant. They were so, especially to people, you know, to people who are gay or otherwise queer, you know, to see ourselves up there, to see ourselves represented, and in an honest fashion, you know, from creators, writers, actors who themselves are gay, you know, as they were in Queer as Folk. That's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. I mean, the writer of Queer as Folk, Russell T Davies, who would later go on to do Doctor Who, obviously. I remember him he toured the country in the wake of Queer as Folk, and he did like panel discussions with audiences that were deliberately selected to be from various different demographics and ideologies and whatnot, and he would show clips of the show, and the show was quite explicit, by the way. It did explore like the sort of, you know, the club scene of gay men, which was very prominent in the UK back then, in all of its, you know, in every aspect, in its permissiveness and whatnot. And he deliberately did that to try and demonstrate that A, it's nothing that straight people don't really do, and B, it's also completely innocuous, right?
Yeah. And, you know, of course, here in the States, we then stole Queer as Folk from you all and did it,
of course,
version. And that was very significant here too, because it's used, like, you know, Will and Grace offered a more palatable and easy, but with Queer as Folk, it showed like you said, it was very big into the club scene. It was very graphic sexuality.
Yep.
And that was something we had never really seen before, where because sometimes I see particularly gay characters written by straight writers where they sort of desexualize the gay character.
Yes, it's the sanitized queer, isn't it? You know, it's the safe queer in many respects. You know, it's the one that's palatable for straight readers or straight audiences.
I know my husband and I watched a show where I'm like, do you notice how the gay guy is the only one who never has a relationship? I'm like,
yeah.
So, but like with Queer as Folk, like, you know, they showed us as sexual beings. So
yep.
I always tell people, if they ask me about writing queer characters, I'm like, you don't have to show a character having sex to give that character sexuality.
No, like, not at all.
The character being queer may not have anything to do with the plot, but it should have a lot to do with that character's personality.
Yeah.
Because it's going to affect, you know, it depends on, like, you know, where you grew up, what time period, but, you know, it's going to have an effect on the character. So just putting a label that says gay on a character isn't enough. You have to show, well, how does that affect the character?
Yeah.
And I always say my litmus test is, do they treat the gay character differently? Like that show I was talking about, like, I see the gay character is the only one who never has a relationship. So bullshit on that one. So
absolutely, yeah.
You know, if it's a fast-paced, action-oriented thing where nobody's personal life is explored, fine.
Absolutely fine.
You singling out the gay character for just making them bland and with no personal life, and I'm like,
It becomes
not doing
token, doesn't it? It just becomes tokenism then, and it's almost like having your cake and eating it, isn't it? It wants the kudos for being inclusive, but doesn't really want to go the full mile.
Yeah, exactly. Because I have a friend who was like, "Well, you don't want creators pandering to a gay audience," and I'm like, "I am perfectly willing to be pandered to as long as you give me authentic characters." Because
That's it. As long as there's truth in it, it's fine, right? I mean, like, and this is another thing. It's again, it's singling out queer audiences. Like, straight audiences are pandered to left, right, and center in every aspect of culture. It's something you see when you really step back and you start to look at things like, for example, like advertisements or television commercials, and you look at how heteronormative they are in almost universally. Even now they're almost universally heteronormative, certainly in the UK, and the degree to which heterosexual sexuality is deployed in those commercials or advertisements. And the thing is, straight audiences generally don't see it. They don't notice it because it's become so normalized. Whereas if you had even if you have the suggestion of queer characters in a relationship in like a daytime advertisement, it causes some ructions even now.
And it's just like I've had people say if there is an ad that features like a gay couple, and they're like, they don't care about you, they just want your money. I'm like, do you think they care about you? It's advertising all our money. But I grew up in a time when nobody wanted to court our money. They didn't want to, but now they see us as a viable demographic.
Absolutely, to the point whereby they're willing to sort of alienate, vast other demographics who are opposed to our existence, and that's a powerful statement. Even it doesn't. The intention doesn't really matter, Okay, yeah, it's corporate and it's they are sort of pandering to, it's what we call the pink pound here in the UK, or I suppose it would be the pink dollar in the US, But yeah, it doesn't matter because it is representation. You are going to have like queer young people, queer kids, who are seeing this and realizing that this is who they are and that it's okay. It's just part of existence.
And it's, I knew someone who said he didn't mind, queer characters in something as long as it made sense that they would be there. I'm like, I mean, you do realize we're everywhere.
I was going to say that's another thing, right? It's like, yeah, we're everywhere. I mean, what's the current estimate? And I'm sure this is very conservative, but it's that 1 in 5 men, isn't it? Apparently, 1 in 5 men are supposed to be gay, and I imagine that's a very conservative estimate, and with reference to very prescribed and defined terms of what constitutes gay. So, yeah, we are absolutely everywhere. You may not realize it, but we are absolutely everywhere. If you've got a cast of characters and there's more than a handful of them, then there's going to be some gay or otherwise queer characters in the mix.
And that's what I told him. I'm like, it always, because he said it needs to feel organic. I'm like, it always feels organic to me because no matter where I go, there's a gay guy there.
Exactly that.
And I love the fact I was telling my husband not long ago, I feel like anytime these days that we watch some streaming show that's an ensemble, you're going to have some queer representation because and I feel like the more it becomes normalized, the more we realize that, as you were saying, conservative estimates, the more normalized it comes, the more we realize how prevalent it really is.
Yeah, absolutely.
As much as they used to.
And sort of how inefficient the terms and the parameters that we have used to define not just sexuality and orientation, but gender identity and so many other things, how inefficient they actually are in describing like the range and the variety and the fluidity of human identity and experience.
And it's always amazing to me how much that scares people.
Yeah.
They greater because and they always fall back on the they're worried about the children.
I've
And
heard
like,
about the children. Well, not enough though that they're not willing to allow queer kids to commit suicide en masse. Not that worried, right?
um, just, well, if we had just prevented them from becoming queer by not showing,
Ah,
but because I feel sort of, I'm like, look, I grew up with nothing,
yeah,
but
likewise, right?
it was just I was bombarded with heterosexuality, and it did not
Yeah,
make me remotely heterosexual.
not at
So
all. And by the way, we're talking not just sort of images of heteronormative relationships and weddings and all of this, but flat out heterosexuality, right? Even the pornography that we would have been exposed to would have been straight for the most part.
and and they I've heard parents say like, well, if my kid sees this, what am I supposed to tell them? I'm like, it's as simple as telling them people are different.
Exactly that.
Body is exactly the same.
Yeah.
So that's not, because I really they think if they can just keep it
Hmm.
hidden, then we're just going to die out. I'm like that is not.
No, it's never going to happen. This again, we're going back to Barker here because this is the argument he makes so brilliantly in Sacrament. He just explicitly says it, and it's really incendiary the way he frames it. He says the genocidalists, the people who fancy themselves our enemies, could succeed. They could somehow succeed in wiping out every queer person who's currently alive on the planet, and they would still fail because, and the term he uses is there are queer little babies growing in straight mothers' wombs right now. Give it a generation, we'll be back. So, there's not they're fighting against humanity. There's nothing they can do.
My joke is always we're insidious.
Yeah.
Yeah. We can, I am living proof that you can be the most redneck white trash Southern family, and a queer is gonna pop right up in there.
Absolutely. I'm kind of the equivalent, working class, come from the Midlands of the UK, little town, very, very sort of towny ideology, very insular, very almost sort of like an incestuous little culture, and I tell you what, the queer community here is huge. For such a little town, the queer community is absolutely huge.
I discovered that too when I started to come out. I was in this small southern town, and I'm like, oh, because I went through that period where I'm like, I'm the only one.
Yep.
I'm just completely alone, and then I realized, oh, we are everywhere.
I think technology has helped with that as well. The existence of things like, for example, for all of their evils, things like the dating apps, and whatnot. They've demonstrated that there's more of us than anyone would ever have believed. We're everywhere.
I know. For me, growing up before the internet, it was the first time some friends from college took me to a gay club.
Yeah.
And I walked in, and I'm just like, there's so many of us, and we're in a place where we're not afraid to and it was just amazing to me. And
yeah,
and again, that's why it always seems so weird to me how much we were not represented in the horror genre when I was growing up. Because I'm like,
yeah.
we are everywhere, so it's, to me, very glaring when we're not.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because genres like horror, like fantasy and science fiction, we do have this tendency to gravitate towards them. For many and various reasons. Horror in particular. One of the things I do notice about queer horror, not universally, obviously, but generally, is that there is this greater sense of ambiguity about it. So it doesn't generally conform to the traditional dynamic of there being sort of like innocents, heroes, villains, and monsters. Very often there's a great deal of ambiguity. Certainly on the latter end of that spectrum, the villains and the monsters are given far more in the way of complexity and intrigue and motivation, because so often we are those characters, right? Culturally speaking, we have been monstered and demonized and cast as those characters.
And what affected me so greatly from the works that I read from Clive Barker, and then also from Anne Rice.
Yeah, of course.
They took the creatures that were considered the monsters in most mainstream fiction and made those, like in Cabal by Clive Barker.
Yeah.
Anne Rice's interview, vampire books, like what the world sees as the monster, they show their sensitivity and their strength and their power and their beauty. And that was very, even when I first started reading them, I wasn't really understanding that on a conscious level, but subconscious, I was getting that message that, just because the world calls you a monster doesn't mean you are one.
Absolutely. And in Barker, certainly in Cabal, it's that celebration of monstrosity, right? What Barker tends to do is say, well, actually, wherever there's a monster, there's a miracle, right? There's something beautiful. There's something of worth here. And very often, certainly in Barker's work, they're counterposed to forces of civilization, tradition, and order. Often, in Cabal, it's absolutely explicit. You've got like the characters that represent those archetypes, right? You've got Deckard, who's the psychiatrist. You've got, and it also turns out to be an absolute monster himself. You've got the police forces who are actively violent and oppressive, and you have the priest character, all counterposed to the Nightbreed, to the children of Midian, who are all framed as miraculous and beautiful and worthwhile.
And that, I've tried to explain this to people sometimes too. Like, that to me with Barker is the quintessential thing, that even if he's not writing about queer characters, he's writing with a gay sensibility.
Oh my God, yeah. Oh, yes. Absolutely. They are. It's queer fiction, right? It is absolutely queer fantasy and horror that he's writing. As you said, I didn't get this. I didn't understand this like on an explicit or conscious level, because I was 11. I didn't really have the context or the language to understand it. But it was Weave World that I read first, and it somehow, somewhere inside of me, I understood. I got that this fiction is talking to me as a sort of putative or nascent gay man, on a level that, even the stuff that I really like and really enjoy, like Stephen King's work and James Patterson's work and whatnot, wasn't.
Yeah, exactly. It resonates in a way that does not make it inaccessible to a straight audience. Makes it extra special.
Yeah.
For our audience. And I had someone say to me before too about my work, like, he thought he was being helpful.
Yeah.
But he said, because there is such a large straight male horror audience, I needed to give them someone to relate to. And I'm like, they can relate to gay characters.
I was going to say they can relate to gay characters. We're human. We are human. There is overlap with experience here. We're not aliens,
Life relating to straight characters, they can relate to queer characters.
Exactly that, and we've done that. The first quarter or half of our lives, we've done that. So,
and I do feel like that thinking is starting to go, because I do feel there are a lot of straight male horror readers who are not afraid to read works by queer authors with queer characters, because I think there are people, they're just hungering for something fresh.
Yeah.
The more diverse voices you get into the genre, the more exciting and different takes on horror you're going to get.
Yeah, totally. I can't believe some of the stuff that's come out over the last 5-6 years, certainly in the small and independent press. Some of I've read stories that I've never read the like of before. And I do consider myself pretty well read in that regard, certainly in this genre. There's stuff like This House of Wounds by Georgina Bruce, or All the Fabulous Beasts by Priya Sharma. I just cannot believe the work. It's unbelievable.
And
it's unbelievable.
it excites me so much because I read some books, and I think this is the book I was dying to find when I was a teenager.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when I write, that's kind of what I'm doing. I'm trying to write the books I was looking for.
Yeah.
But I feel like now young queer people who are coming up and are horror fans, they have it. It's there for them, and it's exciting to me.
Yeah, me too. Because it's gonna resonate with their experience, and that is the most wonderful thing. And to think that you're doing it too, that you are having this incredibly profound, impactful effect on, a young queer person's imagination and sense of identity, and hopefully doing something really fulfilling for them. I kind of lack the language to explain what that is like.
And I know here in the States, that is why the conservatives always immediately go for the books.
Oh, yeah.
They're always trying to ban certain books because they know it's powerful, not because a book is going to turn a young person queer, but it empowers them to know we don't have to be ashamed. We don't have to hide.
Exactly that. It's exactly that. And it gives people, books and fiction give people narratives and context that are outside of conservative prescriptions. It dilutes the power of tradition and the primacy of the assumptions that mean that they are not in control of the playgrounds anymore. It gives people the ability to realize that, there were never any boundaries, that in the first place, there were never any fences here other than those that the conservative ilk insist upon.
And, growing up in a very conservative small southern town and the family that I did, what saved me and kept me from staying in the closet and trying to pretend I was like everyone else was the library.
Yep.
I found in these books that the world was so much wider than my small town, that there were different kinds of people and different kinds of ways to live. And I mean, that's why I love movies, but books are always my deepest love. And I think it's because I felt like books sort of saved my life and gave me the permission to not follow in the footsteps that were put before me, but to really be myself and blaze my own trail.
Yeah, that is exactly it. I mean, that there is such overlap of experience there. I think it's something you'll find amongst any and all of certainly not just the queer creators in this or any other genre, but those who are from demographics that have always been marginalized, or sort of disallowed from the mainstream. It's a revelation, isn't it? And I mean that in the sense that Barker would use it. It's a metaphysical experience. It's something that changes who we are in a very profound way. And I still remember the feeling of that. I still remember the feeling of like my mind efflorescing and opening up, like the doors of perception blowing off after reading certain works. Stuff like Weave World. Later on, I discovered Billy Martin writing then as Poppy Z. Bright, and that again just blew open the doors of perception.
Funny because I almost mentioned Poppy Z. Bright earlier. After Barker and Rice, when I discovered his work, it was just he was writing about alienation, and weirdos and freaks and outcasts and people who didn't fit in.
Doing it with such fury as well. I mean, such incredible, like a young person's fire.
And it was just, I could, even though the experiences of the characters were not mine, there was so much I could relate to and feel seen.
Yeah.
Reading that, and then, just peopled with, queer characters. And I will say, in that time period where there wasn't a lot of representation, the Del Abyss line, they really had a lot of, because they were also publishing Rick R. Reed.
Right.
And even like I know I read one of their novels by Brian Hodge, where the main character is in, and just that line. I have a lot of love for that line, but that's one of the is they did not shy away from queer representation when they were putting out their books.
No, and it must have been like that's sort of like the frontier. It's the forerunner, isn't it? It's when it started to really happen. It's when you really started to see how the influence of like slightly earlier writers like Barker had changed the landscape, right?
Yeah, and I'm excited to see that continuing even today.
Yeah, it's an amazing time. It's an amazing time to be immersed in this stuff, to be, both a creator and a fan of this material, because it's just everywhere. And I'm even I mean, what I really love to see now is there's even discussions within the genre happening within our communities and our cultures. There are contentions that we're dealing with through our work that's exclusive to us, right? It's our concerns, and it's something we've been denied for so long in these arenas, and it's wonderful to see it happening.
Yeah, it's great to feel like there really is a place at the table for us. And I'll see something like I feel like right now one of the writers of the moment is Eric LaRocca.
Oh my God, this sort of like came out of nowhere and just.
And I mean,
oh my God, yeah, incredible, right?
Love seeing that. I'm like, a queer person writing very unapologetically queer work, and is just being celebrated, and it's something that I don't think I would have seen grow in my teen years, and it's so exciting to see that now.
Absolutely.
And it's just, I love that if somebody asks me for some recommendations of queer horror authors, I actually have a list I can give them.
Yeah, right. That is the most wonderful, wonderful thing. And also, I mean, like in the digital age, we can even we can interact with them now too. You can go and talk to Eric on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, and that is amazing. Hailey Piper, really active. Really active on Twitter. It's fantastic. It's an absolutely wonderful thing.
Yeah, and like I said, because you can interact with them that way, it's even more empowering for young people that they can love a book by Hailey or Eric and then actually message them and get a message back. Something.
Absolutely, yeah. And that, I mean, that also goes for straight writers too. I mean, there's people like Stephen King. He's very active on Twitter, isn't he? He's very active on Twitter.
And before her death, Anne Rice was very responsive on social media to her fans.
That's fantastic, isn't it? That's a lovely thing, right?
I can remember writing fan letters to writers and mailing them like through the publisher. The fact that you can actually have a one-on-one conversation.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? I mean, I remember I think I wrote an article for the Ginger Nuts of Horror. I wrote this very long article about Sacrament and its metaphysics and what it means to young gay men, to queer people in general. I spoke about how I would make it required reading for young queer people, because it gives us a sense of how we can build our own identities, how we can establish a narrative for ourselves. And I got a message from Phil and Sarah, the people who run the Clive Barker Info website. They basically deal with Barker's like online presence. And they said that he'd read it and that he really enjoyed it. And he was very, very, appreciative of it. And I had a heart attack. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to. I didn't respond for the longest time because I did not know what to say. Other than a very timid sort of thank you.
I will say I read that article and it was awesome.
Oh, thank you so much. I just couldn't. It's that degree, that ineffable gulf that used to exist has shortened quite significantly, hasn't it?
Yeah, and everyone talks about the downsides to the internet age, and there are some, but I even as a writer, I work at a university bookstore, and so I work with a lot of people who see me at this point as ancient.
Yes, of course. Especially not to stereotype too much, but in our community, we're getting on, aren't we? We're edging into daddy territory at the moment.
I assume I was described by someone in the college as having dad vibes, but
I love it. Dad vibes, love it.
I probably imagine me like churning my own butter and stuff like that. But
Puritan, right? Fantastic.
I talk to them I tell them, if I had to research something, I had to stop writing, go to the library, book, look at now I love just being able to be in the middle of something.
Yep.
Just flip on over to Google, look it up, find it, pop it in there, because I didn't mind real life book research, but it's so much convenient because it doesn't have to stop my flow.
Exactly, and it doesn't sort of take up half a day or more.
I mean, even in my office, I have I still have the big Webster's dictionary that I used to use in college because I didn't used to have a computer that would tell me how to spell things.
Right. So yeah.
I appreciate all the convenience of the modern world.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and for us, for not only as gay guys, but as creators, as writers, right? It has been just a gateway. It's opened up so much. It's allowed us to establish an audience and to make contacts in a way that we probably would have found very difficult otherwise.
I mean, especially, depending where you live, like where I live, there's not a lot of promotional opportunities.
No.
This area. So to be able to have this tool to really get yourself out there. And I still remember when I first got on the internet, back when it was all message boards.
Yeah, the frontier. It was this wild, lawless new frontier.
I found this this group online that was called Gay Horror Enthusiasts.
Oh wow! Even back then, right?
And this was sometime in the 90s, and I was just so excited. I'm like, there's a group of us. There's a community of us. It was just. It really did. I do think horror. I mean, I know that also with the internet, there's a lot of the latest drama in the horror.
Yeah, of course.
It just gives me. I've met so many wonderful people. I mean, I certainly never would have been able to talk with you.
No, this is the thing, right? This is the thing. I mean, you're right. There is always going to be that negative side, as there is in any arena where you've got lots of human beings sort of interacting. It's always going to happen, isn't it? It's always going to happen. But I'll be honest, my general experience, certainly in the horror community, has been almost universally positive.
I mean, it also enabled me to be able to talk with, because I don't know a lot of other writers in this area.
Yeah.
But I've been able to actually talk with other authors, use them as soundboards, get advice from them.
Yeah, made actual friends this side. Some of the people I've met, I've really connected with hard. People like Kit Power. We get on like a house on fire. We really do. Lex Jones went to his Halloween party last year. That was great fun. I talked to Justin Park in the last episode. We've got a lot of. What really annoys me, Justin? He's amazing. We've got so much in common. Of course he's straight, isn't he? Of course he's straight. Really, really handsome. Loads of connection. Straight. It's so annoying. I hope you're listening to this, Justin.
I'm not judging their deviant lifestyle. Whatever makes them happy. But
Yeah, right. It's incredible, isn't it? The connections that you can make with people who are, you would never have come into contact with.
yeah, because I did feel so isolated growing up and like
Hmm.
such a weirdo, not just because I was gay, but because I was such a horror geek.
Yeah,
And
likewise.
so it's great to have this community now that makes you realize, there's lots of us.
Yeah, and I mean, it's what this is all about, really. I mean, and it's what increasingly is happening. As these episodes stack up, we're noticing more and more and more that there is this commonality of experience going on, and I love that. I love that to absolute bits. We're slowly accruing a sort of archive of horror creators' influence and inspiration, and I love it. Absolutely love it.
I love that you let me be a part of it.
No, thank you so much. I mean, absolutely wonderful. I feel that we're drawing this to a close now. So before we go, Mark, is there anything you'd like to pimp out?
Well, I do. Well, I have a lot of books. Check me out on Amazon, but I do have.
I mean, by the way, all the links to Mark's author pages and whatnot will be down below.
And I do have a book coming out this May. It's part of Crystal Lake Publishing's Dark Tides series. It has novellas by 3 different authors. The one I'm in is called Against the Clock. I have a novella in it called Septic, which is based on a incident that happened when I was in high school. So I'm very much looking forward to that one. So be on the lookout.
Excellent. Again, links below, by the way, ladies and gents. As for myself, as per usual, you can find me knocking about here on the Exaggerated Elegy channel, where there will be more episodes like this and lots of discussions between lots of different people. You can find links to all of my published work over at strangeplaygrounds.com. And if you fancy chatting, you can come and chat to me over on Enigmatic Elegy on Twitter. Mark, again, thank you so much. That was brilliant.
I had a lot of fun. I'm a natural born babbler when you get me started.
Likewise. So we got on quite well there. Thank you once again, and bye-bye, guys.